Today's webinar is sponsored by Intilaris Life Sciences. Intilaris is a Swiss-based clinical development consulting company and is extremely pleased to be able to sponsor this presentation today by Ken Getz.
In studies that CISCRP, a nonprofit organization, has conducted, this is a recent one done in 2015, where nearly 3,000 patients who had participated in trials responded. What they looked for were the top 5 aspects of the volunteer experience that they liked least. And 4 of the 5 were related to the burden of participation, which in many respects is tied to the demands of the protocol and whether the compensation is commensurate with those demands. On the right-hand side, just as an aside, we also fail to engage and to thank our study volunteers. We put them through very, very difficult study volunteer experiences or participation experiences, and yet at the end of the study, the vast majority of volunteers never even receive the results of their own clinical trial. And we know that there are a number of trends, including even regulatory agency interest in having the return of plain language research summaries become a more standard practice in the future. Another area of impact is associated with site noncompliance and fraud. And this has been an area that the Tufts Center has been monitoring for quite some time. Up through the early 2000s, the FDA received a relatively low number of complaints for site noncompliance and fraud. In fact, an average of 10 up through the year 2000 per year. And then it jumped tenfold in 2001 and jumped up again in that period 03 to 2005. What led to that increase? Well, much of it was due to the convenience and the ease of being able to register a complaint. The FDA launched a toll-free 800 number and a website where complaints could be filed online. It was also a time period in the early 2000s where we saw a number of tragic patient deaths in clinical trials, Jesse Gelsinger and Ellen Roche, for example. And those really triggered much heightened sensitivity. But also, we saw a growing number of sponsor companies and their study monitors, CRO study monitors, filing complaints, most of them, or a large percentage, associated with protocol deviations. And that is the #1 reason today that investigators are cited for noncompliance, protocol design violations. Protocol amendments are highly associated with complexity. And on the left-hand side here, you see the average number of amendments per protocol, with our phase 3 studies having the highest average number, 2.3 per protocol. Phase 2 studies also have are higher than our phase 1 or phase 3B4 programs. The #1 reason for amending a protocol for our 2, 3, and 3B4 protocols is a change in eligibility criteria, typically to relax the eligibility criteria to make it easier to attract patients into our studies or to help them qualify to participate in our programs. Our amendments are extremely costly. These are unplanned, these are unbudgeted changes to our protocol. Our recent study has shown that the implementation of an amendment typically takes an additional 3 months or adds 3 additional months of time. And for a phase 3 protocol, each amendment costs more than $500,000 in direct costs to implement. If you actually take the total cost of all amendments for all active protocols, what we see is anywhere from a $6 to $7 billion a direct cost outlay each year just to implement all of the amendments for active protocols. Interestingly, a high proportion of all amendments occur before the first patient has even received the first dose. And many have felt that this is a clear indication that in our haste to get the protocol out to the clinic, we don't spend enough time really thinking about and challenging the feasibility of our study designs. So let's now shift our attention to look at ways that we can optimize protocol design. And certainly focusing on the improvements in executional feasibility is a very important place to begin. We know of many, many instances now where organizations have been working on their protocol authoring approaches, and there are a number of approaches that are widely available to the broader community, including the SPIRIT initiative, which was developed by a global community of medical writers. Transcelerate now has a common protocol template that you can review as well. And there are a number of others. All of these essentially have a number of similar principles. Number one being the effort to create a line of sight, a visible connection between the endpoints and specifically our primary and key secondary endpoints, and the procedures that will help support them. And the primary goal of many of these authoring tools is to ultimately identify those procedures that don't have a clear line to the primary or key secondary endpoints. Many of the authoring tools also offer insight into ways of avoiding protocol amendments by minimizing the number of typographical errors or quickly identifying a protocol design flaw as you're going through some of the basic authoring approaches. We also see efforts to solicit input either internally or from external parties before the protocol has been finalized and approved. Many organizations are now using their own feasibility review committees. These are typically made up of a multidisciplinary group of people who work with the clinical teams and review the protocol design with a specific focus on improving feasibility and trying to streamline and reduce the number of procedures and the complexity there. We see many organizations that are beginning to use patient and investigative site advisory boards to talk about their impressions about the schedule of assessments or the eligibility criteria or the procedures that are being required per visit and what impact that may have on challenging and raising the participation burden. Some organizations are using adaptive designs and other approaches where they're actually planning up front and spending more time up front trying to anticipate design changes and to actually get pre-approval to make those changes before the protocol has actually been finalized. And in a few instances, we're also seeing some organizations rely more heavily on data that's drawn from healthcare payers and providers, health technology assessment decisions, for example, and factoring some of those criteria back into development planning and protocol design as a way of anticipating some of the core or primary areas that may be of interest once the study has been approved. It's a way of creating a more informed way of prioritizing endpoints and procedures that will be conducted. So let's look at a few of these optimization opportunities and see if we can target where to focus attention. That first area is on the incidence of non-core procedures. I mentioned to you early in this presentation that nearly a third of phase 3 studies of the data that's collected by our procedures is non-core. It's not essential to the study, but it is essentially supporting a supplementary or tertiary or exploratory endpoint. Here you see the full distribution, and it includes those procedures that are supporting primary and key secondary endpoints. That falls into our core group. There's a group of procedures that are just standard practices that are performed every time the patient presents at the center or the clinic. We call these standard procedures because they typically are gathering baseline data Many have argued that there's opportunity there to streamline our protocols as well, since some argue that we collect more baseline data than we need. And then the last area relates to those procedures that are performed to support regulatory compliance. And there you see the full distribution. It's really that non-core area that's a good place to begin to really challenge why those procedures are necessary if they're not supporting the core endpoint, and also really to ask the question, is there a way to perhaps if this is a critical procedure, to conduct it at another time, perhaps to delay that procedure until perhaps a post-marketing study, a phase 4 study, so that we can streamline or simplify the design of the pre-approved product protocol. Our direct procedure costs really represent a substantial investment that we make to support our studies. About 48 cents of every study budget pays for those procedures that are supporting the core, the primary or key secondary endpoints. And you see the rest of the distribution. This here is only the direct cost. It does not include the indirect personnel costs to actually conduct these procedures. And we know it's many magnitudes greater. This does vary by therapeutic area. But these direct costs, if we were to aggregate them just for all active global phase 2 and 3 clinical trials, we estimate that we're spending anywhere from $4 to $6 billion annually just on the conduct or administration of procedures that are non-core or less essential to our study design objectives. Our amendments, as I mentioned, it's very, very helpful and critical to think of them less as a problem and more as a solution to an underlying problem. Here, it gives some insight into where the underlying problem may lie within the design itself. This most recent study was conducted in 2015, and we asked protocol authors at a variety of companies to categorize amendments according to the level of avoidability. And we found that 45%, nearly half, were deemed by the authors themselves and by the clinical teams themselves to be somewhat or completely avoidable. And there you see some of the cause categories: the design flaw itself, an inconsistency or error in the design. And much of this can be addressed through new protocol authoring tools. The recruitment challenges, the infeasibility of the recruitment, and much of that even picked up by the investigative site when they have a first look at the protocol design. So this gives you a flavor for some of the key areas, those particular amendments where we might focus attention to reduce them. And remember, an unplanned and unbudgeted amendment adds approximately 3 months of additional time, and for a phase 3 study, more than $500,000 in direct costs to implement. So this represents a significant opportunity for some cost savings. We see a large number of mid-size and major companies now using a kind of a feasibility review committee or mechanism, and many are already reporting some improvements, most notably in the reduction of the number of protocol amendments and improvements in site work burden, perhaps by moving or changing the schedule of assessments or reducing the number of procedures that are performed per study visit. So all of those efforts, even in early reports, indicate that we're starting to see some improvement and some enhancement. The Tufts Center recently completed a study with the DIA looking at a wide variety of patient engagement initiatives that companies are implementing, and we found that a fairly high percentage are piloting or now broadly implementing patient and professional advisory boards, in addition to a number of other approaches like the use of home nursing networks and wearable devices to improve study volunteer convenience. And those are really critical. The whole patient engagement area is one that we're looking at intently now with an effort to try to understand how we can understand the value of these efforts to really address a lot of the internal resistance to fully implement these approaches in the absence of a clear return on investment for these patient-centric approaches. Adaptive trial designs is a very important area. This is an older study. We'll be updating this later this year, toward the end of 2017. What we found in this earlier study, and it was very consistent with a study conducted by a working group at the DIA, is that roughly 1 out of every 5 clinical trials today is using a simple adaptive design, like an early termination due to safety or efficacy futility, some type of change to the sample size and re-estimating sample size while the study is underway. What is most valuable about the adaptive design is the additional upfront planning that is taken to really challenge and think through what changes might be made to the protocol and to anticipate those in advance. And that's an important way to minimize disruption, to make all of it essentially transparent to avoid and minimize the number of delays downstream.